Welcome to IUSB. What follows is a short presentation to walk you through the English placement exam. We begin with slides to help you strategize about responding to the writing prompt and conclude with slides that walk you through the online space and how to navigate the exam itself. The first thing to note is that it's very important that you take your time and that you're thoughtful as you respond to the exam. The exam, in fact, determines how many English classes you will have to take as a student at IUSB. Many incoming students are required to take a full year of first-year writing or English composition, but those who are particularly successful on the exam may only need to take a single semester. So obviously this affects how quickly you can graduate. But most importantly, we want you to make sure that you take your time and that you're thoughtful so that we can place you in a class that's appropriate for your writing skill level. In a few minutes, you'll receive 2 writing prompts, and we ask you to skim through both of them relatively quickly and pick the one you like the best, the prompt you find the most relatable, inspiring, or understandable. These next few slides, I'm going to walk you through an example writing prompt, but obviously the example is different than the 2 prompts you'll see in a few minutes. But the key is every writing prompt has these 3 basic parts that I'm going to walk you through. The first part is an introduction to an excerpt from an academic text. In our example, it reads, "Consider the following passage defining literacy, adapted from the Introduction to a College Writing Text by Sarah Garnes." So essentially in this introduction part of the prompt, there's 2 important pieces of information to note. The title of the excerpt, in this case defining literacy, and the author's name, Sarah Garnes. You'll want to reference these things in your own writing. You'll say something like, Sarah Garnes, author of Defining Literacy, and you'll summarize some of what she describes or some of the important ideas from her excerpt. But then once you've referred to the author by full name and referred to the title of the essay, you can simply refer to the author by last name throughout the remainder of your response. The second part of every writing prompt is the excerpt itself. So once you've picked the prompt you want to write in response to, you'll want to go back through it and read it much more carefully, since good reading and good writing go hand in hand. As you read back through the prompt you've selected, you'll look for things we call key terms, which are essentially themes or big ideas that the author really wants his or her reader to understand. Key terms are recognized often because they're used multiple times in a passage. Usually the author carefully defines the key term because they want the reader to understand the term or idea in a specific way. And again, the key terms are used to convey the main idea or ideas in a passage. So here's the second part of the writing prompt, an excerpt from an academic text. And in this case, we've identified the key terms. The very first word in the prompt, literacy, is one of the main terms that comes back repeatedly in this excerpt. In this case, the author, Sarah Garnes, wants us to understand that literacy can be more than reading and writing. It can be becoming familiar with different communities, social situations, and cultural groups. And she argues that people can become literate in different social situations and in different communities and experiences. So the second part of every prompt is the excerpt itself, and the third part is a series of questions to help inspire your writing. So these questions, you can sort of just skim through them quickly, but if you already know what you want to write about, you may not even need them. They're intended to help get you thinking, but you don't want to use them as a checklist. So it's not as though you wouldn't want to respond to all 3 bullet points. Instead, you'd want to pick one and use it to shape your response. The key here is not to let these questions deter you from the main jobs we ask you to complete as you respond to the writing prompt. And I'm going to go through these in more detail in a few slides, but essentially in the instructions, we ask you to connect the ideas in the excerpt or passage to a personal example from the real world, use key terms to discuss your example, and work with at least 2 quotations from the excerpt. And again, I'll go through this information in a bit more detail in the coming slides. Once you've finished watching this video, you'll click Next at the bottom of the screen, and that will take you to this page, which is the Honor Pledge. Here, we essentially just ask you to read this and click Next. But by clicking Next, you're acknowledging that the writing you submit is in fact your own work. Basically, here we want to emphasize that it's really important that you do your best, but that in fact it's your original writing and your original ideas in the response. If you have somebody that you view as a better writer, for example, respond to the writing prompt on your behalf, you're really doing yourself a great disservice because you may end up in a writing class that's not appropriate for your skill level, and you'll feel overwhelmed and struggle to be successful in the course. So the other thing we want you to note is that it's important you don't use spell check or anything like that. We understand that you don't have that available as you respond to the exam, and we take that into account when we review your results. So after you've read this, you'll simply click Next at the bottom of the screen, and you'll move on to this page, which are the instructions for responding to the exam itself. So once you open the exam, you'll see the two prompts that I've mentioned previously. You'll skim through them. You'll pick the one you like the best. For the prompt that you choose not to write about, it's very important that you type an X in the box below that prompt. And then for the prompt you do choose to write about, you'll type your response directly into the box below that prompt. It's important that once you've chosen what you're going to write about, you type your name at the top of your response, so we know, in fact, who is responding to the exam. If you know it, it would also be quite helpful if you have your 10-digit university ID number and include that alongside your name. While your name is absolutely vital, the 10-digit university ID number would just be a nice piece of information to have. But again, it's very important you put your name at the top of the response. The other thing we note here on the directions page is that you have 75 minutes to respond to the exam. So this should be plenty of time. But if for some reason you run out of time and the 75 minutes expire, the exam will automatically submit and the placement committee will be able to see that you got cut off. So there's really no reason to rush because we'll take that into account as we evaluate your response. Lastly, the fifth part of the instructions essentially tell you to contact the Gateway Information Center at IUSB if you have any technical difficulties or problems as you respond to the exam, or you can contact the Student Service Center email. Once you read this, you'll simply click Next at the bottom of the screen, and you'll move on to the exam itself. At the top of the exam itself are these instructions. These instructions again remind you to type an X in the box below the prompt you do not choose to respond to. And then as you're responding to the prompt you have selected, you'll want to follow these instructions, which I mentioned briefly previously. First, we ask you to analyze and evaluate the ideas in the passage or excerpt by connecting them with a detailed and specific example from your own experience or observation. So when we say analyze, we essentially want you to break down the ideas in the passage. Think about how the different concepts work together. And then when we say evaluate, we essentially want you to make a judgment call. Do the ideas in the excerpt hold up when you think about them in terms of your life, in terms of the real world, and in terms of the personal example that you're going to discuss in your response? You want to essentially connect the ideas in the excerpt to your real world example. And one way to do this is to use the key terms you identified as you read the writing prompt. So you'll recall in the example excerpt that we looked at, the author was arguing that literacy is broader than reading and writing. It involves familiarizing ourselves with different communities and social situations. So you could tell a story about a time you joined a basketball team and how you became literate in the sport of basketball and got to know the players' personalities and became literate in the specific conventions of that social situation. The last thing we ask you to do in these directions as you respond to the writing prompt is make use of two specific quotations from the excerpt or passage. And here we urge you not to just plop the quote into your own writing, but instead provide a framework for the quote. The framework would consist of providing a sentence or two before the quote that explains background information. You want to pretend you're writing for an audience that's never read the excerpt, so you really want to make sure you slow down and explain the details, what's happening in the passage at the time of the quotation. Then you'll integrate the quote into a sentence of your own. Sometimes this can be a fairly simple move where you just say something like, Garn states. And then after you've pulled in the quote, you want to provide a sentence or two of your own to explain what the quote means in your own words. So you'll try to incorporate all of these things into your writing response after you've read the excerpt. Once you're done with your writing response and you feel pretty confident about it, you'll click the Next button at the bottom of the screen. This slide is essentially a reminder. This lets you know what the X will look like when you type it into the box below the prompt you do not wish to write about. But this is an important step, so we want to reinforce this and show you what the X in fact looks like. Then you'll, of course, type your response below the prompt you have chosen. You'll click Submit Quiz at the bottom of the screen. And it may be a little bit jarring because essentially you'll get a new screen, but it'll look quite similar to the one you thought you were exiting. The difference will be, you'll click the Submit Quiz button, which is the first box on this slide, but then you'll get this attempt history at the top of your screen. That'll basically show you have a score of 0 out of 2, but that essentially just means that nobody has scored your exam yet. Nobody has read it. So what you need to do here is scroll down all the way through. You'll see the box with the X below the prompt you did not choose, and you'll see your response. You'll scroll all the way down, and you'll click the Next button one more time. And that will take you to this screen. which essentially congratulates you on finishing the placement exam and reminds you that you don't see specific results. You don't see your score on the exam right away. And in fact, the English Department Placement Committee takes all of the exams and reviews them. Usually this process takes 7 to 10 days. So to see your results, you'll have to check back in with the placement office website in about 10 days, and then we'll have your score available for you. So as final reminders, you have 75 minutes to complete the exam. If the time expires before you're finished, your response will automatically submit, so there's no need to rush. The placement committee will be able to see that you cut off, and we'll take that into account as we evaluate your response. Make sure you put your name, and if you have it, your 10-digit university ID number at the top of your response, so we in fact know who is responding to the exam. Make sure you place an X in the box below the prompt you have not chosen to write about. And if you have time, proofread. You won't have spell checker available, and we'll keep that in mind as we evaluate your response. But it's always helpful to make sure your ideas are clear and that you've cleaned up spelling and grammatical errors when possible. So thank you very much for your time. Best of luck as you respond to the exam, and welcome to IUSB.